Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Old Norse poetry is hard to understand. If you disagree with that, you are either lying or you are a genius beyond my comprehension. I have a PhD in this subject, which is not to say that I'm a smart guy, it's to say that I have the ability to study something with discipline. And I have been just banging my head against a tree trunk about this for 20 years. I understand the basic details, I understand how alliteration works, for example, but if you had asked me before this month why certain syllables are stressed and others are unstressed, I would have said, I don't know. There is sort of roughly 2 stressed syllables per line and then, shrug a certain amount of unstressed. And that's basically how it was taught to me because very few people actually understand this. But I have recently come to understand it and I want to share how I understand it with you. Now, there is a long tradition of study in the metrics of Old Germanic languages. And most recently, very comprehensive studies of this have been done by the scholar Seiichi Suzuki, including in his 2011 book, which is 1,100 pages long, called The Meters of Old Norse Etic Poetry. Now, this book is difficult to read, to put it concisely. It is a work of genius, I will acknowledge that, but I think that it overcomplicates this a little bit. Uh, Probably any book that's 1,100 pages long can be accused of overcomplicating something. Um, the first person to explore this question in a really ingenious way was the German scholar Eduard Sieversch, who in 1885 published an 80-page account of how the meters of Old Norse Etic poetry work. And I think that this book is truly ingenious, but like a lot of geniuses, I think that he didn't quite know how to present it concisely, even though it's much more concise than 1,100 pages. I think Sieversch is basically right, and it has taken me forever to get to the moment where I woke up one morning and I said, oh, I get it now. Partially, I mean, of course, because, we're talking about a book in dense 19th century German. So it's not exactly, uh, it's not book club reading. uh, but I want to present to you my concise statement of uh, more or less Sieversch's view, probably slightly modified by my own. Um, Lack of intelligence, to put it as a con, um, willingness to teach in a concise and effective way, to put it as a pro. All right. So the first thing you need to understand, you you don't need to understand Old Norse to understand this video, but there are 2 things that you need to understand. One of which is very basic. It's the difference between unstressed and stressed syllables. Now, this isn't always taught super well, so let me just review it real quick. In English and in most other languages, there's a difference between a syllable that has stress or emphasis and a syllable that doesn't. So, in the word emphasis, M is stressed and F is an emphasis. Uh, if we say emphasis, we're stressing the wrong syllable. Okay. In a word like execute, the stress is on X, it's not on ek. If we stress ek, we say execute, and that's not the word. So we need to distinguish between stressed and unstressed syllables. In English, there is not a predictable pattern of stress. Words can be stressed on the first syllable, like ranger. They can be stressed on the second syllable, like become. They can be stressed somewhere in the middle, like disputatious. But in Old Norse, there is a regular pattern. Old Norse is easier in this respect. Old Norse always stresses the first syllable. So no matter how long a word is, the stressed syllable is the very first. So I often encounter people making mistakes like this with names, because in English we often look at long words as foreign, and we tend to think of foreign words as more often being stressed on later syllables. That's not the case with Old Norse. So a name like Brynhild, stressed on the first syllable. Now, if there are more than two syllables, there will be secondary stress, but the secondary stress is never on the last syllable. So the last syllable will never be stressed. So if you see a compound word, like say longvinir, it's not longvinir, it's longvinir. Primary stress is on the first syllable, secondary stress is on the second syllable, and the third syllable is not at all stressed. Okay, these are the basic facts that you need to understand for what follows. Now, in a line of Old Norse Eddic poetry, and in this video I'm talking about fornyrðislag, which is the basic meter that the other meters are based on. I will get on to other meters probably in a different video, but fornyrðislag is the place to start. In fornyrðislag meter, we are not counting syllables in a line. This is actually an aspect of this that took me an extremely long time to understand. In English poetry, we are counting syllables. So for example, in iambic pentameter, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, we have 10 syllables, and they regularly alternate between a drop, an unstressed syllable, and a lift, a stressed syllable. We go drop, lift, drop, lift, drop, lift, drop, lift, drop, lift. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? In a line of Old Norse Eddic poetry, we have 2 lifts, and the lifts do not necessarily correspond to 2 syllables. A lift may consist of 2 syllables. A drop may also consist of 2 syllables. So we count lifts and drops, and we have a system by which we can convert 2 syllables into 1 lift or 1 drop. Okay, that's very important to keep in mind. So when I say that a line of Old Norse Eddic poetry, this is the basic building block, has 2 lifts and 2 drops, I don't mean that it has to have 4 syllables. I mean that it has to have 2 lifts and 2 drops. Each lift might actually be composed of 2 syllables. Each drop might actually be composed of 2 syllables. I live in a windy place. I would say it's not my fault, but I guess it is for living here. You would live here too. Forgive me if the wind is loud, but I think I'm blocking it with the rest of my body. Okay. So the 2 lifts and the 2 drops can be just 2 stressed and 2 unstressed syllables. Gur, nu, garm, mjok. Gur and garmer are lifts. Nu and mjok are drops. But a lift can consist of 2 syllables, in which case your line can be 5 syllables. So this is called resolution in the scholarly literature, by the way. What happens is the second syllable has to be the unstressed end of a word. So in Old Norse, it's going to mean it has one of the unstressed vowels in it, a, I, u, and perhaps a consonant. It might be or in, or on, or un. But it's going to the second syllable and the resolved lift is a unstressed ending. And the first syllable and the resolved lift has to have a short vowel. That means a vowel that doesn't have a long mark. A, e, I, o, u, e. And it's not ash, which is always long. And it's not a diphthong. O, a, u. It has to be a short vowel. A, e, o, u, e. O. Okay, and it has to be followed by just 1 consonant. So, fyr gnippa heli, gnippa is a lift on its own, and it's resolved. Gnippa can function as a lift even though it's 2 syllables, because the second syllable is an unstressed ending, it's a, and then the first syllable is a short vowel, short I, followed by just 1 consonant. Gnippa. So gnippa, metrically, if you want to think of it as syllables, then it's being treated like it's 1 syllable. That's not the way to think of it. It's 2 syllables that constitute 1 lift. Okay. So there, the resolved word is the first word in a compound, and that's okay. Old Norse is full of compounds. But in the next 2 lines of the same stanza, we see an example with a freestanding word. Fester mun slitna. Okay, nothing's resolved here. Fester is a lift, mun is a drop, slit is a lift, na is a drop. Note that R does not count as a syllable, so fester counts as one syllable. Might have actually been pronounced as such early on. You know, at one point it was fests. You know, maybe here it's still a French like fest, something like that. But then the next line, en freki rena. Freki is a lift, right? It's two syllables, but it's one lift because it ends in an unstressed ending, that I, the short I, and then the first syllable is a short vowel followed by one consonant. Freki, that's one lift. So en freki rena is drop on n, freki is a lift, ren is a lift, na is a drop. Okay, now a drop can also consist of two syllables if both are short and naturally unstressed. A lot of words in this group have vowels that are written with a long mark in our classical spelling orthography for Old Norse or in modern Icelandic spelling. But before 1140, we know from the first grammatical treatise that they had short vowels. The most important words in this group are se, si, or be, subjunctive, sjo, si, or this, or be, subjunctive, tho, then or them, nu, now, and thu, you. Those words are treated as short for these purposes. So the next two lines of the stanza from Völuspá that I'm using as an example, fram se ek lengra, fram is a lift, se ek is a drop, resolved drop, leng is a lift, ra is a drop. Then fjold veton fröda, fjold is a lift, veton is a drop, fröd is a lift, a is a drop. You can have diphthongs and long vowels in a drop, especially if they are verbs. So Old Norse privileges nouns and adjectives as lifts. If you have three words in a line, a noun, an adjective, and a verb, the noun is the most likely to be a lift, the adjective is the next most likely, and the verb is the least likely. Okay, so having established what lifts and drops are, let me remind you briefly that you should check out my good friends and partners at Grimfrost. You should get your Viking gear from people who actually care about doing it right. They make accurate Viking Age replicas of things like jewelry and even tools and weapons and board games. And they do runes right. They actually do Viking Age runes. Often I'm the one who's done their younger Futhark appropriate Viking Age runes. Also, you should read Norse mythology translated by someone who is not afraid to admit that he knows more now than he did 10 years ago, right? I don't do this channel to stoke my ego and say I've always been right about everything. I have not always been right about meter, and I'm getting it right now. I've also learned a lot more about every aspect of mythology and language in the last 10 years. And so the 10th anniversary second edition of my Poetic Edda includes 100 pages more material as well as completely revised translations. So I really hope you'll check that out when it appears in fall from Hackett Publishing Company. And if you're interested in it right now, you can join my Patreon at patreon.com/NorsebySW, where at the highest tier, you get a monthly live preview with me of the work that I'm doing on that Poetic Edda translation and Prose Edda translation that's coming after it. Okay, so we talked about drops and lifts and how they can be resolved. What kind of patterns are there? Well, Siversh identified 5 patterns, A, B, C, D, E. I'm actually going to talk about them in terms of their frequency in Old Norse, which are different from their frequency in Old English, which I think is what the lettering is about. But the only thing you need to adjust to make them appropriate for the frequency in Old Norse is switch B and C. So A, C, B, D, E are the order of frequency. So in A, it's lift, drop, that is, it's two trochees for people who are into that technical terminology. Festrum and slitna, that's an A line. C is drop, lift, drop. So en freki rena is a C line. If you want one that doesn't have resolution, oxlo horpu is a C line. A B line is drop, lift, i.e. it is iambic for people into the technical terminology. So Ragnarok is a B line. A D line is Lift, lift, drop, drop. Usually the first drop is actually kind of secondarily stressed. This is very often the second word will be a compound word where the what would be the stress syllable in the second word in the compound becomes a secondary stress, and so that's counted as one of the drops. So rum sigtiva, lift, lift, secondary stress, drop. And then E is similar. That's going to be lift, drop, drop, lift, often with the first drop being the second word in a compound. But a good example line for this is vituð en eða what. E is very rare in Old Norse, so this is one of the few E lines you're going to find. In vituð en eða what, the first lift is resolved and the second drop is resolved. Vituð is one lift, eða is one drop. Okay, and just remember that in Old Norse, compounds are stressed like elk, hunter, park, ranger, not like execute, persevere. Okay, so I believe that Old Norse poets in the Viking Age did not have 1,100-page books about the rules and exceptions to their poetry, although those are brilliant tools for modern-day scholars. I believe they probably learned this from example stanzas, and just as kinnings are probably learned from a poem like Alvi Small that lists a lot of kinnings, just like runes are probably learned from the rune poems. I believe that they've learned example stanzas. And there's a wonderful example stanza for learning this, which is one of the repeated stanzas in Völuspá, which we can add one repeated line from Völuspá 2 to get all of our types. So I've already been citing from it a bunch, but let's go through it. Gur nu garmur mjök. This is an A. Lift, drop, lift, drop. Most usual pattern. Then we have a C. Fyr gnippa helle. With our first lift resolved. Gnippa is our first lift. Then we have another A line, Festermun sletna. Again, most usual pattern, so it reinforces that's the most usual. Lift, drop, lift, drop. Then we have another C, which is the next most usual thing, with resolution on that first drop. En freki rena. Freki is our first lift. Note that in a C line, only the first lift can be resolved, the second one can't be. Then, Fjoð veiton fröða. There we have another A, lift, drop, our usual pattern, but this time it's our first drop that is resolved. Then we have framse ek lengra, lift, drop, that's an A line, again with our first drop resolved. It's se ek is our first drop. Then we have a B line, Ragnarok, drop, lift. Then we have a D line, rom sigtiva, lift, drop, with that first drop being the second word in a compound. And then we have our very rare line that I'm adding to this stanza that's repeated all over Völuspá. Vituð en eða what, that's an E. Lift, drop, lift. Where, again, this is a very rare type, so it's like hard to find. But here, note that both the first lift, vituð, and the second drop, eða, are resolved. They're two syllables counting as one lift or one drop. All right, so that's an ideal stanza that I've learned from, and I hope you can learn from if this interests you. But in order for my analysis, my derived, if someone wants to be ungenerous, dumbed down version of Xerxes' analysis, in order for this to work, it has to work on every syllable, on every stanza, right? It can't just be ideal stanzas. So I used dice to pick a bunch of stanzas from all over the Poetic Edda, and did not let myself avoid one that my dice landed on. So let's look at the stanzas I got. So first of all, here's Brot of Sigurða Kviðu, stanza 10. Þó hvað that Gudrun. All right, Gudrun is definitely lift drop. Þó hvað that, we could read this potentially and probably just as an A. With hvað that, we've got a verb and a pronoun. Those are both very low on the rankings of words to be lifts. So those can probably be considered a resolved drop. Þó hvað that Gudrun, that's an A. Gjúka dóttir, easy A. Mjölk mælir þú. I'm doing this live, by the way, because I think that's actually the way to make sure that my analysis works. D. Lift, drop. Miklar Firnir, easy A. Gramir havi Gunnar. That's an A. First lift is resolved, Gramir. First drop is resolved, havi. Noun is resolved as a lift, verb is resolved as a drop. Makes perfect sense. Gottvad Sigurdar. D. Resolved lift, Gottvad. Sig is your next lift. Urð is your weakly stressed, you're sort of half stressed because it's the name is a compound, Sig Varð, Victory Guardian. Ar is a drop. Heftjarns Hugar, easy A. Heaven Skull Verda, easy A. All right, it's going good. Notice, this took me 20 years to figure out, but it's not a random pattern of stressed syllables and unstressed syllables. There are patterns in which these occur, and the key is remembering that the main component is lift and drop. It's not syllable by syllable. Next example, Himmiskvi the 25. O teteriotun, easy A. Erther after eru. That's a C. First drop is resolved, erther. Remember that an R ending coming after a consonant does not constitute a syllable. So after, maybe, afts at some point, that's one syllable. Svo at or himir, another C with the first drop resolved. Svo at is one drop. Ekki malti, easy A. Vevði han röði, A with resolved first drop. Feathers annars till. D. Drop, drop, lift, lift. Excuse me. Lift, lift, drop, drop. Guðrunnar kviða 1, stanza 26. Þó vits í hol. This is a B. Resolved first drop. Þó is a drop. Hunskrar þjóðar, easy A. Eld og jálfur, easy A. Ornbeðs litum, easy A. Þess hefi ek gangs. B. Resolved second drop. E ek is a drop. Goldit Sizan, easy A. Therar Sunar, easy A. Sol A. This is an A with the second drop omitted. So sometimes the second drop will be left out. It seems like A is especially likely to do this. And it seems like this sort of goes together with later poems. So I notice Rígstula, which has a lot of signs of being pretty late, has the second drop omitted all the time in A lines. So it seems like sort of coordinate with being late-ish. I also had a random stanza from another poem that seems late-ish in some other respects too. Guðrunnar kviða 3, stanza 9. Brahon til botns, bjortum lova. Okay, brahon til botns, that's an A. Second drop is omitted because hon til is a drop. So we get lift, drop, lift without our second drop. Okay, so principle demonstrated pretty well, randomly enough. Bjortum lova, easy A. Okhon up tok, that's a B. Okhon is resolved first drop. Jarkna stena, easy A. Senu segir, easy A. Sikken emek orden, A with resolved first drop. Emek is first drop. Helagliga, D. Lift, lift, drop, drop. Huesio huer belly, C. First drop, huesio is resolved. Then I have 2 stanzas randomly picked from poems that have very old looking language in some other respects. And so this is probably going to come up with some characteristics that seem to go together with being somewhat more archaic, right? Viking age poetry. So first is Volundar kviða, stanza 36. Maltra thuthat mol. Okay, Zevers, and I think he's right, says that a lot of the time when you see these extra syllables, what looks like they have too many syllables, is because this is archaic language that used fewer pronouns than the Old Norse that we're used to from the later Middle Ages. So if you drop pronouns, you will often get pronouns and also, well, it's mostly pronouns. We'll see if anything else comes up. But if you drop pronouns, you start seeing lines that actually fit into the system very well. So if we make this maltira mol, then we get an E. Lift, drop, drop, lift. Okay, ermik mer tregi. Okay, this is a C with resolved first drop. Ermik is a drop. Ne ek thik vilja volander. if we drop ek and or thick, well, no matter what, we wind up with some extra drop there, because ne ek thick, that's 1 to 3 extra drops, and then an a, vilja volund. Now, this is something that does legitimately seem to be characteristic of old poetry. Viking Age poetry is what in technical terms is called anacrusis, extra drops at the beginning of the line, but at the beginning of the line. So that ne, at least, even if we drop the ek and the thick, is an extra drop. And that type of anacrusis seems very characteristic of older poetry, especially, again, on A lines. A lines being the most frequent type tend to have the most variation, it seems like, both in earlier and later poetry. Ver umnita, easy A. Erat swol madr hor. This one's tough. Another characteristic of somewhat archaic poetry is lifts on A lines that don't have following drops. So you can also see this in a Ljóðaháttr stanza, like the famous Hávamál stanza 76, 77, where you have just 2 lifts on line 1 and line 2. Dörfe, dörfrandr. Actually, line 2 has 1 drop, but dörfe is just 2 lifts. So we have 2 lifts here, madr, hor, and then erat svo, anacrusis probably. We get 1 to 3, probably all 3 of those are old unstressed syllables. So several signs that the stanza is pretty old here. Athik av hestitaki, this is the same thing. Hestitaki is a good A line. Athik av, 1 to 3 unstressed syllables, anacrusis, archaic. Neswa oblugur, A. Athik nedan skjoti. I'm going to call this C, with resolved first lift. Nedan is a resolved lift. And then athik could be resolved first drop. That erthu skolir. Call it A with erthu as a resolved first drop. Vidski upi, C. All right, the last random stanza that I picked is from another poem that has some other characteristics that look archaic. Sigurd Drífumal, stanza 18. Og gleri ok og guli. All right, here we've got resolved first lift, gleri, resolved first drop, ok all, so we get an A line, gleri ok og guli, and anacrusis, that first unstressed syllable that's characteristic of archaic poems. Ok og gumna helum, exact same thing. Gumna helum is an A line, ok all, anacrusis. Ivini ok virtri, A line. E ok, that's your resolved first drop. The E at the beginning, in, that's anacrusis, archaic. Ok vili sessi, C line. Vili is resolved first lift. Gungnis odi, A line with anacrusis at the beginning, all. Ok grana brosti, C line. Grana is your resolved first lift. Ok all is your resolved first drop. O nornar nagli, A line, nornar nagli, O is anacrusis. Ok all nevi uglu, again, nevi is a resolved first lift, and ok all is your resolved first drop. This is a C line. Well, this has been a good exercise for me. I have always believed that the ability to explain something to someone who is not a specialist is a mark of actually understanding it. Sometimes in academia, you find people who think almost the exact opposite. If you can talk about this to the public, you don't understand it, But I don't believe in hiding information in an ivory tower, and I also believe that, maybe it's just my own limited intelligence relative to some others, but I think that if I can explain something that's how I end up remembering it, right? I've learned so much more from teaching than I ever did before I taught, and it has been my willingness to not just blow off the question of how does this poetry really work, but to actually answer it. That's brought me to being able to go through those examples and actually identify them and give you a systematic answer about what's going on in them. That's, to the extent that I can feel good about something, I feel good about that. But yeah, this has been the hardest thing for me to try to understand in my entire life, other than why this woman loves me. But at any rate, I appreciate you folks listening. I appreciate the support on Patreon, especially people at the Skull tier who are getting live updates about my work on the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. It was those folks who first got the prototype of this presentation when I was still kind of, 80% to where I'd worked out and figured this out. This major stuff has sure informed the second edition of the Poetic Edda a lot, because it's helped me evaluate often between two options what a line is, because you have two manuscripts, which one is probably right because it metrically works best. It's helped me get a better feel for poems that are earlier and later, in addition to other research that I've been doing, like on the Ov question that I've talked about in another video, and have more videos to come about, and I hope research papers to come about. So all of this ties together, and just it's a reminder that it's in teaching that we learn best, I find. And a lot of people are probably better natural teachers than I am, but I think striving to do that teaching and explaining has been good. And look, if you look at every single line of Old Norse poetry, which Seiichi Suzuki has done in his book, you can find I'm sure if you go through all of them, or if you randomly select one from all of them, you're eventually going to find something that doesn't quite submit itself to this analysis. There's also meters that are developed from fornyrðislag, like Ljóðaháttr, which I'm probably going to, still kind of working on figuring out how it is founded on fornyrðislag this way, so I'll work on that for another video. But I think that this explains 98% of lines, and the ones that it doesn't in fornyrðislag, there's probably something else that's happened. They've been miscopied, or there is, some, if we think about it in terms of the more archaic language stage at which it was composed, sometimes that will reveal what's actually going on in that line. Sievers clearly thinks so very often. He's pretty aggressive about amending to an earlier stage of the language, which I've tried not to do here. I've tried as much as I can to make it work without amending it, other than in poems that are clearly very archaic, like Völundarkviða. Dropping those pronouns often does help get you a line that makes sense. All right, I've rambled enough. Thank you, Patreon. Thank you for checking out the books and checking out my friends and partners at Grimfrost. And look forward to that second edition of the Poetic Edda. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.
Okay, but you do have to see the book, baby. The way he carries the 1,000-page book is like this.